Helena grew up in a small town surrounded by green hills and olive groves that changed color with the seasons. It was a peaceful place, where time seemed to pass more slowly, and where almost everyone knew each other by name. Life there was simple, repetitive, and predictable. But from a very early age, Helena realized that there was something different inside her. While other children were easily distracted by games, she often remained silent, gazing at the sky. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't loneliness. It was as if something inside her was always searching for something outside of her, but without knowing exactly what. At school, she first heard stories about Jesus in a more profound way. Not just as a religious name, but as someone who had changed the way people understood love, forgiveness, and life. He was described as someone who welcomed the forgotten, who spoke with the rejected, who healed physical and emotional wounds, and who taught that love was greater than any rule. These stories touched something within her, but they weren't enough. Because, at the same time as she listened to these stories, a question grew stronger and stronger within her. Who is Jesus, really? It wasn't simple curiosity. It was a deep restlessness, as if his soul wasn't satisfied with ready-made answers. She heard different versions around her. Some said he was the Son of God. Others said he was a great spiritual teacher. Others simply repeated what they had learned without really reflecting. But none of those answers seemed vivid enough for her. Helena wanted something different. She didn't just want to believe. She wanted to understand. And, more than that, I wanted to feel. Years have passed, but the question hasn't disappeared. On the contrary, it has grown. At night, lying in her bed, she would look at the ceiling and imagine what it would be like to truly know Jesus. Not as a distant idea, but as a real presence. One night, as the wind blew gently through the open window, something inside her changed. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't a vision. It was a silent decision. She realized she wouldn't find answers by staying in the same place. If he wanted to understand who Jesus was, he needed to walk. I needed to see the world. I needed to listen to people. I needed to live experiences that no book could fully offer. The following morning, Helena woke up earlier than usual. The sun was still low on the horizon, and the city was still partially asleep. She packed a small backpack. She put in bread, water, a notebook, and a pen. Nothing more. Before leaving, he looked at his house for a few seconds. There was no fear. But there was a kind of inner silence, as if something inside her was beginning a new phase. And then she left. The first few days of hiking were strange. The world seemed bigger than she had imagined. Empty roads. Open fields. Small villages where people lived their daily lives without any hurry. Helena asked about Jesus whenever she could. But I noticed something curious. Each person had a different answer. Some spoke with absolute certainty. Others spoke with doubt. Others simply said it was something they believed, without explaining it in depth. None of the answers seemed complete. Finally, after many days of walking, she arrived at a small village near a river. The sound of the water was constant, like the breathing of the world itself. There, she found an elderly man sitting under a tree. He didn't seem surprised by her arrival. It was as if he already knew she was coming. The man watched her in silence for a few seconds. And then he said, "You're looking for something that won't leave you alone." Helena was slightly startled. "How do you know?" He smiled calmly. "Because there are questions that don't come from the mind. They come from the soul." Helena sat down next to him. The river flowed slowly ahead of them. And then she said, "I want to understand who Jesus is." The man took a deep breath, as if carefully choosing his words. "Jesus is not a definition." Helena remained silent. He continued, "Many people try to fit him into explanations. But Jesus doesn't fit into them. The wind passed through the leaves of the tree. It is perceived, not merely explained. It is lived, not merely described." Helena frowned. "But how can anyone know something like that?" The man looked at the river. "Observe the water." Helena looked. She doesn't argue with the river. She simply flows with it. He looked at her again. That's how Jesus is too. He doesn't force understanding. He transforms perception. Helena felt something strange inside her. It wasn't a complete answer. But it was the first time that someone didn't try to explain Jesus as a fixed concept. It was as if he were talking about something alive. The man continued, if you want to know him, don't just look for answers. Look for change. Helena remained silent. Those words kept echoing inside her as the sun began to slowly descend on the horizon. And at that moment, she realized something. Perhaps his journey wasn't about finding a definition. Perhaps it was about transforming along the way. Helena left the village with the sound of the river still in her memory. The old man's words remained with her in a strange way, as if they were not just phrases, but seeds planted somewhere deep within her consciousness. Seek change, not just answers. She kept repeating this as she walked. In the first few days after leaving the village, the road became emptier. The villages were farther away, the wind drier, and the horizon began to open up into an immensity that seemed endless. Then, without realizing exactly when the transition happened, she entered the desert. It wasn't just a physical place. It was as if the world had lost layers. The colors were brighter. The silence was deeper. Time seemed to move slower. At first, Helena felt only the natural discomfort of the journey. The intense heat during the day, the biting cold at night, the constant loneliness. But, gradually, something deeper began to emerge. The desert not only surrounded his body. He was starting to go inside her. The first difficult thoughts came silently. What if all of this is just an illusion? What if Jesus is just a story repeated for generations? What if there is nothing beyond what the eyes can see? Helena couldn't stop these questions. And, strangely, he couldn't reject them either. They simply existed within her, like wind rushing through an open space. At times, this frightened her. But in others, something even more curious happened. Even amidst the doubt, she felt an inexplicable calm. It wasn't certain. That wasn't an answer. It was a presence. She couldn't explain it. But I felt it. One night, the desert revealed its most intense form. The sky was completely clear, and the stars seemed closer than ever. Helena lay on the sand, exhausted, looking up. The silence was absolute. And in that silence, his mind began to speak louder. She remembered everything she had heard about Jesus. Love. Forgiveness. The teachings. Stories of transformation. But he also recalled the contradictions that people carried within them. Different interpretations. Different certainties. Different ways of believing. And then she wondered, how can something so important be so different for each person? There was no immediate answer to that question. But at that moment, something inside her began to change. She realized that perhaps she had been looking to Jesus as the only answer. But perhaps he wasn't that. Perhaps it's something that manifests itself differently in each person. The next day, she met other travelers in the desert. And that changed his perception even more. A man was carrying a small leather bag and walking slowly. Helena approached. Are you traveling alone as well? He nodded. I am. What are you looking for? He took a while to reply. Meaning. That word hung in the air for a few seconds. They walked together for a while. And then Helena asked, what are your thoughts on Jesus? The man looked ahead. For me, he is hope. Helena listened in silence. Further on, they met another traveler. A young woman with a tired face. When asked about Jesus, she said, he is forgiveness. If it weren't for that, I wouldn't be alive inside. Later, they met a third traveler, older, with a calm voice. He is justice. And also mercy. Both things together. Helena realized something important. Each person saw Jesus in a different way. But they all spoke of inner transformation. This didn't seem like a coincidence. As they traveled through the desert, Helena began to notice changes in herself. No external changes, but internal. She was no longer just looking for a final answer. He began to notice how his own reactions were changing. When she felt anger, she remembered forgiveness. When she felt judgment, she remembered compassion. When she felt afraid, she remembered her confidence. It was as if something invisible was rearranging his way of seeing the world. And that both scared and reassured her at the same time. On a particularly difficult night, a windstorm hit the desert. The sand swirled in the air, and visibility was almost zero. Helen took shelter behind a rock formation. There, in the midst of the chaos, she felt fear. But he also felt something unexpected. A feeling that I wasn't completely alone. There was no voice. There was no way. But there was something. Something that couldn't be explained, only felt. And at that moment, a new understanding began to emerge within her. Perhaps getting to know Jesus wasn't about eliminating doubts, but about continuing to walk even with them. When the storm passed, the desert looked different. Quieter. Larger. Deeper. Helena stood up, wiped the sand from her face, and continued walking. But now something had definitely changed. She was no longer just looking for answers. She was being transformed along the way. And, without fully realizing it, he began to understand that this might be the true nature of the journey. After crossing the desert, Helena didn't immediately notice the change in environment. It was as if the world had slowly transitioned from an arid and silent state to something more alive, more human. The wind was no longer so harsh. The ground was no longer just sand. Gradually, small roads began to appear, then houses, then signs of organized life. Until she arrived in a city. But it was no ordinary city. There was something different in the air. It wasn't excessive wealth or extreme poverty. It was something else. It was behavior. Helena realized this within the first few minutes. One man was helping another lift heavy boxes without being asked. A woman was sharing food with someone who clearly wasn't part of her family. A child handed water to an elderly person with ease, as if it were part of daily life. There was nothing strange about those gestures. They were normal there. Helena stood watching, trying to understand. It was then that he asked a lady sitting near a fountain, "Why do people live like this here?" The woman looked at her calmly. "Like this?" Helena gestured slightly. "Helping each other. Taking care of each other. Without expecting anything in return." The lady smiled. "Because here we try to follow what Jesus taught." That phrase kept echoing in Helena's mind. She had heard that before. But now it looked different. More specifically. More experienced. Helena began walking around the city more attentively. And the more he observed, the more patterns he noticed. There was no such thing as perfection. She witnessed arguments. Through errors. Due to normal human errors. But there was something that seemed to permeate all of this. The intention to repair, to take care, to not remain in error. She saw a man who had gotten into a fight with another earlier come back to apologize. No pride. No requirements. Simply regret. And the other one hugged him. Without hesitation. Helena paused for a few seconds when she saw that. That was not common in the world she knew. Further on, she found a young man sitting on a stone step. He seemed tired, but calm. Helena sat down next to him. "Do you live here?" He nodded. "Yes." She hesitated for a moment before asking, "What does Jesus mean to you?" The young man looked at the ground, lost in thought. "He changed the way I see people." Helena remained silent, waiting. He continued, "Before, I saw others as competitors. Or threats. Or obstacles." He took a deep breath. "Now I try to see them as human beings. As someone who also feels pain, fear, and hope." Helena looked at him. "And did that change your life?" He nodded slowly. "Everything changed. This answer was not theoretical. It was lived. Helena spent several days in that city. And each day, something inside her grew deeper. She began to realize that religion wasn't talked about as much here. They were talking about behavior, your choice, of attitude, of practical transformation. And that started to affect her in a different way. Because now it was no longer about what to believe. It was about how to live. One night, Helena climbed a small hill within the city. From there, he could see the lights of the houses on, people moving around, and distant voices. And she began to reflect. If Jesus really influenced those people in that way, so he was not just a distant figure. He was something that came alive through actions. She closed her eyes for a moment. And he remembered the desert. He remembered the doubt. He remembered the loneliness. And he realized something important. In the desert, she learned to question. In the city, she began to see vivid answers. But something was still missing. Something deeper. The next day, she met an older woman who tended a small community garden. Helena approached. This place looks different. The woman smiled. He is supported by all of us. Helena observed the flowers. Well cared for, even though they were simple. Why? The woman replied, because we believe that caring for life is part of what Jesus taught. Helena sat down next to her. And then he asked something more profound. But how can someone who is no longer here change so many people? The woman remained silent for a few seconds. Then he replied, because some presences don't depend on being physically here. She looked at the flowers. They continue to live on through what they awaken in people. Helena felt a slight shiver. This idea was different, deeper, harder to explain. But strangely, it made sense. That night, Helena returned to her room and remained silent for a long time. She was no longer just searching for, who is Jesus? She was watching his impact, and beginning to understand something important. Perhaps Jesus was not just someone to be studied. Perhaps he was someone who continued to exist through the transformations he brought about in people. And that changed everything. Helena left the city with a feeling unlike any other time she had left. There was no urgency. There was no despair. Not even that silent urge to find answers. Now there was something new inside her, a kind of calm that she couldn't yet fully name. She walked, but for the first time she felt that she wasn't running away from doubt, she was walking with it. The world around them was changing again. The houses became further apart. The emptiest roads. And the horizon began to rise. She was approaching a mountain. The climb was long. The wind grew stronger as she moved forward. The coldest air. The deepest silence. Each step seemed to remove a little more of the weight she had carried within her since the beginning of the journey. Not because the questions had disappeared, but because they no longer hurt like before. When she finally reached the top of the mountain, the world opened up before her. The sky seemed bigger. The wind seemed to speak without words. And down there, everything seemed small, distant, but alive. Cities, roads, rivers, all connected in some invisible way. Helena sat down on the floor. And he remained silent. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't looking for anything. No response. Not a sign. No confirmation. It just stayed. And it was in that silence that everything began to reorganize itself within her. She remembered the old man by the river. He remembered the desert and its endless nights. He remembered the city of compassion. He remembered the people, the stories, the simple gestures that carried something profound. And then a realization began to emerge, not as a thought, but as inner clarity. Jesus had never been just a definition. He had always been a transformation happening within people. Helena closed her eyes. And for the first time he didn't ask, "Who is Jesus?" She asked something different, "What does he awaken in human beings?" And that question brought something new. There's no easy answer. but a living understanding. She realized that everywhere she went, something was repeated. When people spoke sincerely about Jesus, they weren't just talking about ideas. They were talking about change. Of forgiveness where there was once resentment. Love where there was once indifference. Hope where there was once emptiness. And that didn't seem like a coincidence. It was standard. It was a transformation. The wind blew strongest at the top of the mountain, and Helena, gazing at the horizon, felt something that didn't come from outside. It came from within. A silent clarity. Jesus was not just someone from the past. Not just a distant religious figure. It was something that remained alive in the way human beings are capable of change. It's about how someone chooses to love, even when it's not easy. In the way someone forgives even when it's not fair. In the way someone sees another person as part of themselves. Helena opened her eyes. And for the first time, he didn't feel the need to keep searching as before. Because he understood something essential. The search did not end with a definition. Transformed into a way of life. She descended the mountain more slowly than she had ascended it. Not because I was tired, but because now every step seemed to have more meaning. The world hadn't changed, but she did. When he returned to his hometown, nothing seemed different on the outside. The streets were the same. The people were the same. The sky was the same. But inside, everything was different. Helena started talking less about finding answers, and more about observing transformations. When someone asked, "Who is Jesus?" she didn't give a definitive answer. She said something simple. He is what changes a human being from the inside out. And then silence would fall after that. Because he understood that some things don't need to be explained quickly. They need to be noticed. Over time, Helena realized something even deeper. The journey was not over. She had simply changed shape. Now it was no longer a search for a distant place. It was a search within everyday life. In the way he treated people. In the way he reacted to situations. In the way he chose to live. And so, without realizing it, Helena understood the truth she had been searching for all along the way. Jesus was not just someone to be found. He was someone who reveals himself in what a human being becomes when he chooses to love, forgive, and understand. And for the first time since the beginning of the journey, she smiled without any questions in her mind. Not because I had all the answers, but because he understood that life was already responding to every moment lived consciously.